And welcome to this week's Mailbox, where we talk about some of the more interesting comments that have been thrown up on my videos from the past week. This week we're going to be talking about the faction balance issues again, some ideas on what they could have done when they were changing heirlooms, and someone's put forward the idea of orcs waiting patiently in line in order to vote. So first of all, a little thing we do at the start is where's the mailbox? So in this particular one, I said at the time, it was a little bit mean because although it should be fairly distinctive, I always say you need to say the specific place and the zone, but technically it was between two zones and I don't expect you to say specifically which zone it was actually in, so sort of either one did there. But it was indeed the Thandal Span, and it's, oh hello, it's between wetlands and Arathi Highlands there, so people got that. Well done. This week's, on the face of it, it's a little bit trickier, but there's an insubstantial clue as to exactly where it is if you look carefully. So what we need is the specific location. It has a name, as well as the zone that it is in. And as I say, it's a little subtle. You may know straight off the bat anyway. I actually think this is unique enough. But if you don't, and some of the individual components are found elsewhere, there is a little insubstantial clue around my character. But anyway, let's get on to the actual questions, statements, comments, whatever we are going to call them. So the first one, oh dear, I'm getting it all wrong today. What's going on? There we go. So I reported this week on an interview that Ian Hazzard-Costas did with Forbes. They do these things from time to time. They're always very good reads. Forbes, of course, being conducted by proper journalists. So although they may not have the same agendas that you or I may have, they nonetheless do very good interviews. And so he was talking about, this massive imbalance, especially at endgame with Horde over Alliance. And that it's the first time I've ever seen them acknowledge that it's a problem. Not just an issue or a thing, that it's actually a problem that they are looking to address. So anyway, so someone's saying here, this was particularly to do with war mode. I have tunes on both factions when leveling an alliance, or any alliance tune, and say going war mode is usually a bad time. Usually find 10 to 1 easily. No chance to fight back. On Horde, I could be on war mode anywhere without being bothered. Which I would say I don't really have this experience. I only had war mode on for the leveling. First few days I haven't really done anything since I don't have war mode on. But yeah, it's the impression I get from the people I know who are playing Horde. Certainly, the impression I get is that actually I could put war mode on, wouldn't even know the difference really. And that's the issue there. And as Blizzard have said, the problem is now serious. It's so serious they can't even use sharding for it. Sharding in theory should be able to help smooth these things out, keep the populations roughly even. But of course, if you've got, just throw numbers out there, if you've got 3 times as many Horde players online with war mode on compared to Alliance players, then it doesn't matter where you are, you're always going to be vastly outnumbered with the Horde. The only way sharding would help there is if it kept them all even, and then that created a load of shards that only had Horde players in it, which would contain the majority of Horde players, which would, of course, not be fair. Because you've got to bear in mind, some of the people who have war mode on are not all that bothered about the world PvP. They're doing it for the bonuses. Most especially, you would think, at the moment, the Horde players, because if they're not even getting bothered, then the people who don't even like the world PvP will just think to themselves, well, it's not like I'm going to be inconvenienced. I might as well put it on for the bonuses. I know that some people have thought that. But if, of course, the people who do want to do that world PvP are the ones who end up in the shards with only Horde players, that's a bit of shitty for them. So you can't really do that. So it does it as well as it can. But if it's overwhelmingly Horde, then or one faction or the other, it can't really do anything about it. I mean, it's really common to a few other comments as well. View on this, I don't really see what they can do. I honestly do not see what they can do. The idea of war mode, I jumped on it as a really brilliant feature just because I could turn it off. It allowed me to choose whether I want to be on a PvP or a PvE server. The problem is, and you know, I know Blizzard are talking about increasing the rewards, and specifically increasing the rewards for the faction that's underrepresented. So obviously that would mean Alliance. It's not that it's a specific extra Alliance bonuses for having war mode on. It would, you know, in theory, if it went the other way, then it would automatically be assigned to Horde. It's just a balancing thing. It's a bit like the satchels, isn't it? When you queue up for LFR or dungeons in the LFD or LFR, it's just there to incentivize, you know, certain people to engage in that content. But the issue is, of course, it almost doesn't matter what those rewards are. If people, and I always say, if I you know, I can't experience this myself. If people are finding on the Alliance that they're logging in and they're just not getting anything done because they're just being completely steamrolled, unless they themselves form a death squad in order to be able to defend themselves. But that basically means doing it specifically to engage in the world PvP, not just potter around doing world quests or something like that. Does any reward help? Will any reward help you? It's a bit like... It's almost like someone in real life saying, I'll tell you what, I will give you £1 million if you let me shoot you in the face with this Magnum. No, there no reward you can offer is really worth it, because I will never get to it. I will never get the benefit of that reward. And it's the same thing here. And of course, if en masse people decide to engage in it, it might well balance it up. But you've got to remember the numbers. Just the number of players. It's not just the number who are selecting war mode are way more Horde than Alliance. The number of players that there are who are able to select war mode, there's more Horde than Alliance. So what you also need to do is carrot and stick. You need to dissuade some of those Horde players from putting the war mode on. And there isn't, because for a lot of those Horde players at the moment, it's just free bonuses. It might be you know, for the people who actually want the world PvP, you know, let me know if you're one of those people in the comments below. It might actually be distressing that you're not finding enough fights, you're not finding enough PvP going on. But for those who are not that bothered about it, they're still getting their bonuses. You're getting your bonus to your artifact power and all the rest of it. So why not just keep it on? I don't know how you would dissuade it. I don't know what they can do. They're in a situation, and I have sympathy for them, because I'm not one of those people who goes, oh, well, 2 years ago you should have done this instead. We bloody well told you so. It makes no difference whether they told us so or whether I told them so or not. I nonetheless have sympathy for a situation someone is in, because the past is the past. You know, and if you messed up in the past, all right. Everyone messes up. You can still have sympathy for them. But I honestly just do not know. I don't know. Next one, which is sort of related. So, in terms of solutions, someone's saying, remember free faction server transfers? I remember. I think that was when they were trying to balance out servers before sharding became as advanced as it is, or even really a thing. You know, that was when the populations went out of whack, and they wanted to rebalance things. But we've now got sharding and linked up realms and stuff like that, so it's not really needed. But anyway, what it says is they should either entice Horde with temporary buff to Alliance racials with free faction transfers, or do away with single faction raid in the first place. So the last one, of course, you know, would help with the raiding. Wouldn't help with the war mode. I'm not sure there's anything that can help with the war mode. But in terms of, so giving temporary buff to Alliance racials with free faction transfers wouldn't work. It would not work. In the here and now, it's got nothing to do with racials. It's got nothing to do with whether or not Horde racials are better or not. For example, so last expansion, I've recruited. This is the first expansion where I will have never done any recruitment, but I've recruited in every expansion in this game for raiding guilds. I have never encountered... I've always been successful at it as well, because I've been very proactive and spent a lot of time on it. Legion is the only one where I failed utterly. And when I was trying to approach people, I had an awful lot of people who wouldn't join us because, you know, they'd much rather go Horde. If they were going to transfer, if they were going to spend money, they'd actually rather spend more money and go Horde. And in terms of me trying to recruit Horde players to come Alliance, it wasn't happening. Was not happening. Zero chance of that. Now, that wasn't the case in previous expansion, because you could argue, well, that just costs a lot. Yeah, it does cost a lot, and for a lot of people, that's a no-starter. But I was able to do it in previous expansions, the last few expansions. Not this time. And what I never from a single person said, I'm going to go Horde. Oh, gone blurry. I'm going to go Horde because the racials are better. No, I didn't get any of that. 100% of the time when it was people saying, do you know what, I'm going to give up on Alliance and I'm going to go Horde, so I'm not going to join your guild. It was always, 100%, always because lots of Horde guilds. So if it doesn't work out where I go, there'll be plenty of others that I can go to. And when guilds decide to go Horde, it's because, well, there's a lot of potential recruits. It is now about the sheer number of people that are there. And the thing is, if let's say Blizzard were to suddenly buff the Alliance racials to the point where the likes of Method would switch and offer the free faction transfers, you wouldn't get an exodus. I don't believe you would, because it would require... No one is independently going to do that because they'll still see recruitment as being a big issue. It would need a lot of people to all do it collectively. In which case... you'd need to know that thousands of others are going to be doing the same thing. And you won't ever know that. You don't ever know that. And if that did happen, it'd actually go too far the other way. That's the thing. So I don't believe it would happen at all, because people would always say, the reason why they're Horde as a player or as a guild is because it's much easier to, if you're a guild, to recruit. And to recruit quickly, because that was another thing. Even sometimes we were able to get replacements. First of all, we weren't necessarily able to get the ideal replacements, and sometimes we weren't able to get replacements for an extended period of time, in which case that really hammers your progress. You end up with way, way slower progress than the quality of your guild should really be getting, just because of that. I mean, it used to be the case, prior to Legion, I could always say of recruitment, right, I can get someone who'd be decent enough, good enough to raid at this level in 2 days flat. But if I have 2 weeks to do it, I'll get someone good, like really good, and drive up the standard of the raid group. Not in Legion. I could sometimes go for months trying to recruit something like a rogue or something. It was absolute madness. So now, in the here and now, I do not see any way. I don't even see a way to chip away at it. There is certainly no magic bullet. If you're going to maintain factions, there is no magic bullet to fix the problem for raiding. And I don't believe there's any solution at all in terms of the war mode. I really don't think there is. But I don't even think... I can't even... If I was sort of said, if Blizzard put me in charge of it and said, look, we'll give you 4 years to just move towards it and chip away at it, I don't even know that I could do it in that amount of time. There's things I could try and just see if we can sort of shift it slowly. But I don't even think... I wouldn't be confident that even that would work. But anyway. And next one, this is another interesting one. It says, an interesting thing to look at was the recent MDI at BlizzCon. Despite all the players being Horde in retail, I believe all the teams went Alliance for the Night Elf racial, which is incredibly good in Mythic Plus, indeed. However, even though that is the best racial from a min-max perspective, the teams are all still Horde on retail because that's where the vast majority of the higher level player base is. At this point, the racials don't master the imbalances too far gone. The other thing to bear in mind about that is that those same players will be raiders. I mean, when it comes to Mythic Plus dungeons, if you're just a super serious top-level Mythic Plus dungeoneer, you just go for the faction that has the best racials for it or the best races for it, because it doesn't really matter. In terms of recruitment, you only need 5 people. This isn't like a raid where, okay, you're raiding Mythics, you need 20 people, but actually you need more than 20 to cover and rotate with classes and stuff like that. No, you're going to have 5 people. And if you're super serious, it's probably just that each of those 5 people probably have a couple of classes to, change around the classes depending on the dungeon, that sort of thing. You will have 5 players. That's it. So there is no recruitment as such. But you do find that those players are generally speaking raiders, and that's why they will be Horde on retail, because it's for the raiding content where it actually matters much more. But yes, I mean, you talk about interesting to note that people will be, for the MDIs where they get to choose, they'll be Night Elf, but actually when you look at those who are getting the world firsts on pushing up the top keys on certain dungeons, they're likely to be Horde, because those players in retail, as you say, are Horde players for the raiding, and they'll just do what they do with dungeons anyway. It is ultimately, in terms of PvE, it's this faction imbalance has all been caused around the raid scene and around PvP. I think like things like rated battlegrounds and arenas, it doesn't really matter, does it? Whereas war mode, okay, that's not it's not a competitive form really, because there's no tournaments for it, of course. But in terms of a piece of content, an end game piece of content, you can't do anything, can you? I just keep thinking about it and thinking, because I like to think of myself as a solution-orientated person. I cannot think of a solution to the problem that they've got. And we can always blame them. We can say, well, this is not something that's happened overnight. It's been going this way for a long time. Way back in MOP was the time when it, I'm not saying it was bad then. It wasn't. I don't think it was. But it was a time when you could start to see things moving, and maybe certainly when it was getting to Warlords of Draenor, if anything, if there was a time when you could actually have done something at that point, that was the time to do it. Or maybe it's just that it's inevitable. It's a bit like in the original, like Warhammer, when I played Warhammer Online, and someone made the good point, actually, I'm not going to put this one up, that World of Warcraft is a PvE game. Ultimate's a PvE game. Yes, there are people who will play exclusively for PvP, but it is a PvE game with PvP literally bolted onto it. I wouldn't even say it's subsumed within the game. It's just bolted on. Some games, I think, have a healthy mix and it properly blends together. And then you have games like Warhammer Online, when it was about, and that was a PvP game. For that, the PvE was the bolt-on. The PvE was rubbish. The PvP was what it was all about. And there was an issue there, like on a particular server, you weren't even allowed to create characters on both factions for fear of people spying and passing messages about what the other faction were doing and what they were up to. So what would happen, of course, is, and because it was all based on world PvP, or RVR as they called it, but the same thing, you ended up with an imbalance. And once you had a bit of an imbalance, then the dominant side would always win, and that meant fewer and fewer people would roll their characters on the weaker side because they'd always be losing, and that just created, the gap just got wider and wider, and there was nothing you could do about it. So all they did is they took a server where it had dominant destruction and a server where they had dominant order and merged them together, and obviously because the game wasn't doing stunningly either, that ended up with not only servers being merged together, a reduction in the number of realms that there were, or servers, and it ended up as a complete mess. And people were talking about the fact that in world PvP, you can't really get away with just having two factions. Elder Scrolls Online uses 3 factions, the idea being there that if there's one dominant one, the other two could sort of gang up on it. Works in theory. I don't know how well it works in practice, but that would at least be better. That's not really... I know people keep talking about the 3rd faction. That's never happening. It's too far gone. Because you've got to remember, again, the social side of the game. You can't just suddenly tell some friends who've been playing together, oh, by the way, you're on 2 different factions now. Unless half of you want to race change. That's never going to happen. Much more likely you should bring it all together for PvE, but that won't help the war mode. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, let's move on from that topic. So, we're talking about tagging here. It's actually one of the good features. In fact, I'm going to be doing a video at some point when I get around to it. There's a few videos I've got on my list that have been hanging around for a few weeks, actually, and one of them is on things that World of Warcraft has taken from other games. So it says, not only should they remove the faction tagging restriction, I mean, that one, I think while they have faction factions in PvE, I don't think they will ever do that. I think they will argue that, you know, that's going to stay. But it says not only should they remove the faction tagging restriction, they should increase the player tag limit. 5 players per mob is stupid, especially in a World Quest area. I agree with that one. I mean, it's all... See, what I would say is this. So you've got a mob. And I'm going to guess that from Blizzard's point of view, they're thinking to themselves, you know, there's probably only so many people who are doing most of the damage on that mob. If someone just gets a sneaky hit on it, well, they don't deserve to get credit for it. With missing the fact that we're not talking about killing a mythic raid boss here. We're talking about killing a mob out in the world that you could perfectly well do yourself if there were no one else about anyway. Does it really matter if someone's done a bare minimum and still getting credit for it? No, it's not. You've got to bear in mind that the alternative is that someone gets frustrated because they find it difficult to get credit for mobs because there's so many people in the area and the respawns are not keeping up with it. So yeah, I think sometimes when Blizzard look at these things, they get the priorities wrong. I'll give you another example, which I'm not at all happy about. I was almost going to do a separate video on this. I probably won't, unless I get really irate. You know, so the 14th anniversary we've got now, we've got the Corgi goggles. They are fantastic. I tweeted about them. I actually think they're the best thing in gaming ever. I'm not kidding. I've never been so excited about anything in a game, in an online game, ever. Like, it's better than AoE looting. The Corgi goggles are fantastic. And then what happened? I logged in today to find out that you can't even have them on all the time. It's now got a 10-minute duration with the 30-minute cooldown. You know. And they've nerfed the goggles. Because Corgi goggles have been nerfed. Their fun sponge department got involved in it. And you know, they just have this attitude. Sometimes they just do these things. And I don't know why they do it. Because they need to, because they keep, you know, Ian Hazacosta says, oh, our only metric is fun. And it's just like, no, it's not. Because if it were, again, you'd think to yourself, what is the compelling reason why you don't let as many people as can get some damage on a mob get credit on it? And for what overpowered abuse of a system are we going to have if we can have the same duration on our Corgi goggles as the cooldown? You know, how is that breaking the game? Oh dear, it really, I don't know. But anyway, as to this point, in terms of that, you know, I absolutely agree. In terms of removing the limits, there's no good reason for that limit at all there. Next one now. This is one of my little pet topics as well at times. It says, I don't get why they always need to create new worlds, planets, islands and stuff. Use the stuff that is there. Most people have not seen classic zones in years. Also don't need new herbs and ores every expansion. Just use the stuff that is already there with the new... I should have deleted all these expletives, shouldn't I? With the new recipes and world PvP is doing. So we'll forget about the world PvP for now. In terms of the zones. Yeah, I've said this before, actually. You know, did a video on it a while ago. Yes, we have a lot of zones that we don't use. And they've... You know, as World of Warcraft has gone on, zones have been updated anyway. The problem is that in a lot of those cases, they've replaced zones instead of just updating them. Like, I always have a bash at the 1 to 60 content that they replaced in Cataclysm. Not only did they get rid of a load of zones and quests that I really enjoyed, but it makes no sense for someone starting the game and going through them. It makes no chronological sense because they do a load of stuff related to events that are in the past, but actually those events are in that player's future. And it's an absolute nonsense. Whereas if what they'd have done instead with Cataclysm is said, right, we want to use these zones to tell a new story, and update a story. Great, do that. Update it when you get to that level. Just like they have done more recently with Tirisfal. Okay, so that area around there has been updated. So as you go from level 1 to whatever, it's like it used to be. But... if you do it, you know, after you've done the BFA scenarios and stuff like that, it's all on fire, Lordran's fallen, all the rest of it. That sort of thing is a way better way to do it. And what it allows you to do is it allows you when you have your new zones in the next expansion, to actually use existing zones, but they've been updated, and that's a far better way to do it. I completely agree with that. I've said for a while, for years, that would be that's the much better way to do it. Yes, okay, so far we've been okay with having new lands and stuff like that. I mean, that alternate Draenor thing, I wish that had never happened. That was a disaster. Don't know why they're bringing it back. But the concept in general of having the world change is actually a really good thing in many ways, because it's like we as players can reminisce. We can say, oh, I remember when this zone was like this. The problem is that new players can never have that experience. You know, new players will start playing the game, they'll talk, and they'll get into guilds, and they'll start chatting, and everyone starts reminiscing, and there'll be the veteran players who will start talking about, oh yeah, I remember when this zone was like that. Those players won't, because they've missed, the Blizzard basically robbed them of that experience. They should have gone through the same process. The fact that they haven't been playing the game for years shouldn't matter. They should go through the same process. The zones that we have to 1 to 60 should never have fundamentally changed. If you wanted to update the graphics and obviously tidy up a few things so we could have flying over it, yeah, like they did that was fine. But in general, the zone should basically have been functionally the same, with similar sort of quests, the same basic quests, and then updated to take account of. So anything that's talking about a post Wrath of the Lich King storyline should not be accessible until we've got to like level 85 or something, should it? Or at least level 80, which is the Wrath of the Lich King levels. Because otherwise it doesn't make sense. If it's before level 80, it makes no sense. Because what's going to happen, you're going to get to level 70 and you're going to be fighting the Lich King. You won't get to fight the Lich King until level 80 at least. It's a nonsense. And yeah, about the herbs and the ores, there's certainly a good case for that. I don't think it matters that much. But again, I do think it better in games where you don't just have the useful herbs, because the past herbs and ores are not going to be very useful to you. So if ever they're going to try and get us out into the world, it's got to have useful things in it. And the idea that we can only get herbs and ore. First of all, we have to have specific professions for it, which is useful. I don't think the gathering and production professions should be, competing with each other for a start. I think everyone should be able to do gathering. And it'd give everyone a reason to get out in the world then, wouldn't it? And then there should be available, there should be content for us to do in other zones that can scale for us. And yeah, they probably should have those new ones as well. We don't need new ore and stuff each one. I think Blizzard might argue though on that one is people would stockpile it in one expansion and then just have a right load of it in the next. So I don't see them ever doing that, because they again, but it all comes down to this attitude they have about expansions, which is very different to what I think an expansion should be. But it is the way they do things, and we just have to accept it. But yeah, they have this attitude that when a new expansion comes around, it's like they want to render all the previous expansions content useless. And I don't think it's that they actively want to do that. It's just that they want to emphasize the new expansions content. They want to make it very distinct. They don't want you using the previous expansion to do anything. That's why, for example, they reduced the gold rewards from missions from the previous expansions and things like that, because they don't really want you going back and doing that. Oh hello, I'm knocking everything over. Sorry, I was doing some model building. Okay, the next one was really super weird. Get rid of that. Go away. Right. It says, I hope the Horde will go for some kind of democratic and or council type rule. It will make them look like the civilized ones for once. Will be a good challenge to the Alliance and our monarchy. This makes, I'm sorry, it makes no sense at all. For a start, let's just break it down into bit by bit. So let's look at the races of the Horde. Orcs are never going to establish any system of either council or democracy. Because you'd have to be shitting on their entire civilization. No Matt Graf, for example. No, this idea of war being good, that's just built into their core. That's it. That's what Orcs are. Trolls, not quite on the same lines, but again, they're not going to elect leaders. Blood Elves are the only ones where you might almost imagine it, but they're sort of have a pseudo monarchy themselves. Goblins, no chance. It's just whoever's got the most money. Undead, they did, didn't they? The Desolate Council for the Forsaken. That's the only ones where you might actually believe it. And Tauren, I don't even know what Tauren do. They just all get high smoking peace pipes, and I don't know how they elect their leader. Never really explained to me that one. But I mean, given that their current leader is the son of the former leader, you could argue that's a sort of monarchy in itself. But yeah, it could you imagine voting? Orcs and trolls and goblins voting. Oh my goodness, no. But the thing to remember as well is it's a fantasy world. It actually annoys me. The reason I sort of picked on this one, it annoys me when Blizzard try and input real world politics into it. It's a fantasy game, right? And we adopt. I mean, bear in mind, even in real life, democracy is a shocking system of government. The only reason we adopt it as the best we can possibly manage is because although dictatorship in theory would be great if it was benevolent and wise, it generally isn't. Even in brief periods of history when it has been that, the next person to take over has been a complete tool or been extremely evil. And that's where it all falls down. So we like the option of being able to change out the leaders if we don't like them. But this, we live, in a fantasy world, it tends to be idealized around the leaders. So we do have, and the good guys do have these systems of benevolent, wise dictatorship, effectively monarchy. And the bad guys will still be dictators, but they'll be the malevolent ones, the greedy ones. And then that's just how that one works. But because I remember in the post, I was talking about the fact I don't like it when stories don't make sense chronologically. But the Westfall story, the modern Westfall story, it annoys the hell out of me because it's not only do you go to Westfall at level 10 as Alliance, and you're going through this storyline about post war against the Lich King, and then at level 70 they're going to send you against the Lich King, which just makes no sense. But also it's this storyline that's clearly parallel to what at the time was a post-Iraq war narrative. Just forcing real world politics down our throat in a fantasy game. No, can you leave that out, please? I remember literally having to stop myself laughing out loud in a cinema once when the Star Wars prequels coming out, and you had and it was episode 2, wasn't it, where Amidala and then it transpired because she's a queen, of course, and it sort of makes sense because she's going to give birth to Leia eventually. She's princess and blah 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 blah. You could see the way it was going, but anyway, and then it turned out that as queen, she was elected, and not only is she the concept of an elected queen. Not only was she elected, that's how they do things on Naboo, but she had 2 terms. Oh, what does that sound like? Oh yeah, American presidents. They just literally mapped on the American system of choosing a head of state to Naboo, and it's just, I find it embarrassing, and it completely breaks my immersion when you see real world politics being put into a fantasy story. Does my head in. Anyway, rant over. Let's get on with the next one. Oh yeah, this should go better. The new forums. I still haven't had a proper look through them, I have to say. But the news just came out really suddenly about, they're changing all the forums. So someone's saying here, says, this sounds like a scam. It's just, I don't think scam's quite the right word, but I'll take the point. It says, it's just a way for Blizzard to make themselves look better by silencing the complainers and rewarding the fanboys that blindly praise them. It's honestly kind of scary. I don't know that scary is really the word. What I would say is, it does sound like it could certainly be used for that. And, I tend to be a fairly cynical person. And I would certainly suggest that things that they've been doing with their forums, their own personal forums, I look at it in 2 ways. I see them trying all these sort of communication features have been putting in. So the communities, well, Battle.net to begin with, and then the communities, and then forums. It's all about getting two things, getting as many people as possible to use them, because they have a direct link. Like when we discuss things on Discord, if it's not a public channel, they have no idea what we're talking about. If we used a forum, they do. And whether that be guild chat or whispers in game, or not that they're nosing in on everyone's conversations, but in theory they could have algorithms looking for certain things. But they're forums as well, so it's a useful way for them to get feedback. But you're quite right, it's also a useful way for them to be able to say, actually, what we're finding is the majority of people, feel this way, that they agree with what we've done here. And it'd be very easy to be able to say that if you're suppressing the counter arguments to that point of view. And this naturally happens anyway, because what you generally find is a post that's praising Blizzard, I'm not saying they shouldn't happen, by the way, not like this evil corporation, but when it's very praiseworthy in that, and that's the way the post goes, then that forum carries on and carries on. And if people really getting into it, and it reaches the limit, then the community managers, that's what I'm trying to think of, will increase the limit and you can carry on going. Now, if you have one that's been critical, it may do the same, but it's also very easy for a critical post to go a bit far. People get frustrated and they go too far and end up going into territory of like being rude, really. And that can generate some extreme reactions, and then it's quite easy then for those same community managers to go, actually, this isn't acceptable, or this is going off track because it's generating an argument, and it all goes off topic, and that thread gets locked down. So although I'm not going to say that they deliberately lock down the critical ones and keep the praiseworthy ones, I think it just naturally happens that more of the praiseworthy ones are likely to remain open, and more of the critical ones, because they will generate people who just don't behave themselves, they will, get locked down. And so, yeah, you could, and because I've said this before about Blizzard, that they keep talking about, well, they said themselves, I don't mainly say because they've said themselves recently, that how do they tell what is the good feedback and not? And I've sort of said the problem is, of course, because they keep getting told by fanboys, as you say there, the white knights, as I would call them, that everything they do is fantastic. So it's easy for them to view critical stuff, particularly if it's not very eloquent, as being someone who's just complaining because they're bad at the game and they're blaming the developers for that. Because that happens. That's the thing. I always liken it to warriors as they used to be in vanilla, and particularly in TBC, back when So what would happen is, if a tank died, well, that was the healer's fault. Because it's one of those ambiguous situations. If a tank dies, maybe it's the healer's fault, but maybe it's the tank's fault for not looking after her own health. Because there's a dual responsibility there. A tank is responsible for, taking as little damage as possible, using their abilities to do that, position and all the rest of it. But at the same time, they can't keep themselves alive on their own, so they need healers as well. So there's that little whose fault is it? And it's the same thing when they lost threat. Was it because they weren't generating enough threat, or was it because a DPS did too much damage? Because that's the thing, you couldn't just do your maximum damage back then. You had to keep below a certain threshold, which is why we didn't really talk in those days about, classes and specs, which ones could do the most damage. It made no difference because you were limited. All you needed to do with your class, with your character, could you get up to that threat limit or just below that threat limit? In which case, there might have been another class that could do double your damage. Makes no difference. They can't actually do double your damage, otherwise they'll die. So if someone pulled aggro, the tank would immediately go, you've done too much threat. But maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. So you always had to investigate. And it's like that a bit with the Blizzard things. They can look at critical stuff and maybe... And they can just dismiss it as, oh, this is someone who's just bad at the game and won't accept responsibility, won't get better. So they're just blaming the game and by extension us. Because that happens. That does sometimes happen. But that doesn't mean to say that all the criticism is that. And yes, I think, you know, the way they've talked about these new forums is just going to increase that. It's just going to create their own extension of their own echo chamber. And I don't know, scary is the word for it, but it is disappointing because it means that they will still get to blindly ignore certain issues, and ultimately it's going to be to the detriment of all of us. It'll be the detriment of us because we're going to enjoy the game less than we would, and for some people that level, because there's a point at which you say, okay, the enjoyment of the game is enough for me to carry on playing it. It may not be as high as I would like, but it's still high enough. That's the zone I'm in. It's still high enough for me to want to carry on playing it. But there will be some people for whom it dips below that bar and then they stop playing it. And then that's to the detriment of the developers as well, because then their game becomes less popular, and that accelerates its eventual demise, because everything comes to an end at some point. I mean, we still hope it's going to be years away, but at the same time, they can plan as much as they like, but numbers will ultimately be telling. They will never pull the plug on this game while it is so popular that it's making a ridiculous amount more money than it costs to make. But at the same time, they will never keep going with the game. Even if they've got 3 more expansions planned with storyline stuff, they will not do it if all of a sudden there were too few people playing it to be financially rewarding enough to carry on. And that's ultimately it. So yeah, it's disappointing, I would say. Anyway, on to the next one. So this is another one of my favourite topics, heirlooms. Mainly because I'm well known for saying that I do not like the levelling experience for either new players or for veteran players who want to level more alts up. So someone's saying here, on the topic of heirlooms, I haven't levelled much since the 7.3.5 change, but before that my issue was that I wanted to get XP as quickly as possible, i.e. use heirlooms, but not to make combat meaningless by one-shotting everything, i.e. not use heirlooms. So there really was a niche to be filled out there. So what of course happened was, for those who don't know, is heirlooms, as they do now, there was, on most of them anyway, not all of them, but most of them, there's like an experience boost there, but also stats that scale up with your level, and it used to be bloody good gear. And so that meant you could just sort of wade through everything. It was a lot quicker to do stuff. It was great. It didn't matter to me personally, because I used to boost my character through dungeons anyway, after a certain point. But nonetheless, there is this divide. There's the people who just they've done the game. They've done the leveling part of the game. They've done all the quests. They don't really get anything different on another character, on another class. They just want to get that class to level cap. So they want it to be as quick as possible. So they didn't like the heirloom nerf. Then there are the people who say, well, it's a bit crap in dungeons for, you know, players where you can be a player and you've not got your heirloom gear and you're not actually doing anything useful in that dungeon at all. In fact, you can go further than that. You can say that you are in your heirloom gear, but you're playing a class where there's a lot of ramp up, like mages, for example, unless you're just going to fire ice lancers at everything. If you've got to wind up a fireball and then it's dead before it gets off, it's a bit crap. You're like not doing anything. So, in which case, the heirloom nerf was a good thing. And it seems that these are mutually exclusive situations. You've got to have one or the other. It's not actually true. It's not actually true. So what they could have done, okay, is you could have had your heirloom gear nerfed as they did, so that people still have to do in dungeons decent damage and things like that. I still think that's too weak an argument when the dungeons, especially the way it is now, I mean, it's better than it was, actually. No, since scaling it is better than it was. But nonetheless, it's still not the largest part of your leveling experience, okay? Especially as they've massively reduced the amount of XP you're going to get from it. So the questing is still the bigger part of it. And that you can do at your own level. But anyway, just taking the dungeons thing. So they could have actually nerfed the sorry, not the heirlooms. They could have actually removed the XP from the heirlooms, is what I actually should say. And then what they could have done is introduce into the game experience scrolls. Now, given that the experience boosts are effective for veteran players who've already seen the content and don't mind missing out a load of quests, these could be bind on account items that you obtain by doing world quests, say. You know, it could be, as well as the emissary caches that we have, if you do a certain amount of content in a given day, you get an experience scroll, and you battle, you know, account wide, that you could just send to lower level elves, and then they've got an experience boost. So maybe the heirlooms is something you choose to use for just scaling gear instead, and you can choose to have the high damage stuff or something like that. Now, then you come to another argument that someone said on my channel. I did respond to it. I didn't get a response back, but it doesn't matter. So what they said is that they didn't like being in a dungeon and everyone else has got heirlooms and they don't, and they therefore feel much weaker and they get a poorer experience out of it. Now, although I accept that that might not be a great experience for them, what I would say to that is that by forcing those other players to do lower damage so that you can contribute more, and I understand, you know, because I'm not saying that they're choosing to have no heirlooms. They might be a new player and they don't have access to heirlooms. What I would say, though, is in that situation, you're suggesting that so that one person in an MMO, one person can have more fun, but 4 people should actually have less fun. That's not really very democratic. It's not very fair, you know. And although I have sympathy for the person who's doing those dungeons and not being fully involved in them, it's happening at points. It's that's old content. And I have to say, if I'm playing a new game, in fact, I've done this when I played Star Wars: The Old Republic, and I've gone into what they called operations, or whatever the hell, I can't remember, the dungeons, the equivalent of dungeons, not raids. I don't mind at all if people go herring off and do it really quickly. I'll just follow them as best I can. That's fine. That's okay. I'm still getting to see the storyline, which is an important thing in Star Wars: The Old Republic, and everything else. So yeah, so in that particular case, because just summarising what I'd be suggesting that heirlooms don't have the experience boost, but they do have the stats boost. So you could choose to have that or not. And you get your experience boost from scrolls, and you can acquire, let's say, every day if you just do a few world quests. Let's say if you do an emissary quest, right? You turn in emissary quest, you've done your 3 or 4 world quests, depending on which faction it's for. You automatically get a bind on account 2-hour 100% experience boost. Okay? And that's fine. You know, that, and you get one of those every day, I think that's more than fine. And I know there might be some people who will easily spend more than 2 hours a day leveling their characters, but, you know, having 100% for 2 hours, I think that would be, because you're not going to get 100% with your heirlooms anyway. That's almost like 4 hours worth, because it adds up to about 50%, doesn't it, or something like that? Can't remember exactly. I think that would be fine. I think that would be fair. And it would allow people to choose the heirlooms or not. And as I say, the only people that would now not be happy with this solution, as I say, are the ones who group with people. They don't have the heirlooms, other people do, and then they feel that they're not able to match that level of performance. But again, you're talking about 4 people's enjoyment or 1 person's enjoyment, and it's just simple. It's simple democracy in my view. Anyway, let's move on. Right, okay. This is where I'm going to express some sympathy for Blizzard, just to balance it all out. So it says here about, this would explain why they so quickly dismissed the question about being able to use classic gear as transmog in the current game. They simply can't understand why some of us would want that, and why they couldn't bother to update the Trial of Star rewards for the 3rd event. So I was talking about the fact that I just don't believe that the Blizzard developers value cosmetic rewards. There are cosmetic rewards in the game, but they don't really, it's way less than it could be. And the thing is that gets me is, you know, when I talk about the fact that if they were to use cosmetic motivations, they could get us out into the world really easily, as if that's a good thing. Blizzard themselves have said that they want us out of the cities and out in the world. So it's a stated aim of theirs, and I cannot understand why they're not doing the very obvious things that would enable that to happen. Other than the fact that they just don't understand the very powerful motivating factor of cosmetic gear, because I think they personally must not think it's that motivating. But in terms of the classic gear as transmogs, what I will say to defend, you know, I said in the video when I talked about it, I'm not majorly bothered about it. The reason is not because I don't want to be able to get some of those things that I deleted myself anyway. I do. You know, I absolutely think, and I feel strongly enough, that I believe it's attached to the same battle account. You're paying for the same. It's the same account. It's the same everything. You know, gear that you acquire and get on your characters in Classic WoW should be saved to your Transmog in your online things. And the reason I say that is, one, it doesn't affect the Classic WoW experience at all. And I also, you know how when you pick up a piece of gear that you haven't, and it gets saved into Transmog, you get the little line that says, this has now been saved into your wardrobe, or whatever the hell it calls it. I don't believe that line should ever appear in the Classic WoW game. Don't have that. Just have that it does it. It doesn't tell you, that's all. It does it. It pops up in your other game. That's fine. So that way it's not ruining anyone else's Classic experience. And as some people have said, it would actually encourage more people to play the Classic. Remember what Blizzard want us to do. You know, they want us playing the game more often, so we're more likely to subscribe. Now, if people were doing that and playing, they're not bothered about us necessarily playing the retail version, although I'm sure they'd prefer us to. You know, if we're just playing whatever the account is that we need to pay for, then that's fine for them. So it would encourage more people to play that. Now, where I'm going to slightly defend them is, what I've noticed is that there's a number of what I might term Classic WoW narces. Now, I don't think these are the majority. Now, when I've talked about the different sort of people who will play Vanilla WoW, so we can break it into largely three groups. There's the people who play retail WoW, the modern version of WoW, have never played Classic. They'll be curious. They'll try it out. Most of those players won't like it. So they'll just, you know, they'll start off with a lot of... And I can see straight away, I'm going to predict straight away, this is the way the pattern's going to go. It's going to be... You know, when it comes out, loads of people are going to play it. And then everyone, all the Classic fans are going to be saying, there we go, we told you, Classic WoW is way better than the modern version. Look how many people are playing it. Then the numbers will jump straight down quite quickly. And then they'll probably say something like, oh, well, that's because they didn't really bring out the genuine WoW experience. Something like that. Usual nonsense. But anyway, there's the players who will try it out and not enjoy it, because at the end of the day, if you're into modern WoW, the Classic WoW, if we're honest, it's got a lot of nice things in it. I'm going to play it. But it's not as good a game. Just objectively not as good a game. Then there's the second group. They're the ones like myself who play the modern version of WoW, but we also played vanilla. Or at least we played old enough expansions, and we'll play it for nostalgia's sake. So, you know, and we'll play it. Because we know what we're getting into as well. We know what we're going to be getting. So there's not going to be any of us who don't want to play it. We'll just not play it. There's none of us in this camp going to be playing it and go, oh, it's a load of rubbish, because that would be stupid, because we know what it's like. Then there's the third group. Now, these are the ones who do not like the modern version of WoW. They genuinely like the original version of WoW, and they don't like the modern version. Now, within that community, there is a minority, I would say, but a very vocal one, who not only want Classic WoW, they actively do not want other people playing it. So if someone were to suggest to them, who are not, their experience will not be affected one iota by allowing this transmog to be in. If it were to be suggested to them that a good reason for having it, even though it won't impinge upon their experience at all, would be actually even more players will play it, because they'll be playing it for transmog. Those same people will say, well, I don't want it specifically because I don't want those players playing Classic. The sort of ones who bang on all the time about the social aspects of Classic WoW, and yet will be so unsociable as to actively say, I don't want those players in Classic WoW. I don't want them in my dungeons. I don't want them in my raids. And I think probably Blizzard are just taking the view that if they have to put something in that's not technically strictly proper Classic WoW, for technical reasons or financial reasons, they'll do it. But anything else, I think they're just going to say it's not worth the hassle. So I'm going to defend them on that point, even though I think it's disappointing. And on to the last one. So, it says here, I don't think we should be that... And I've only done this because it triggers me whenever someone says something like this in a minute. It says, I don't think we should be that harsh on the story writers. I think the faults made are simply because there is so much fantasy. Should they have been able to kill Sylvanas? Yes, probably. Should it have taken J.K. Rowling 8 books to kill off Voldemort? No, you would just bring a gun on the first and they shot him in the head and be done with it. What about Lord of the Rings? Take one person and one hippogriff and fly into the mountain with the ring on a suicide mission and that's done. Cock-ups like this are necessary in the fantasy universe where there will simply be a way, simply and quickly to be over with. No, that's missing the point in lots of ways, and I'm going to have to go through every single one of these things. First of all, this thing about, I think what they're probably talking about, because there's lots of cock-ups in the story writing recently. One of which, of course, was the cinematic where the Alliance leaders went in after Sylvanas, at least 3 of whom wanted to kill her, and 1 of whom was prepared to kill her, and none of them killed her. And even let her get to within murder range of Anduin, and none of them did a thing about it. Again, growled, I think, if I'm low. It was a very low growl at that. And it wasn't, but so then they've tried to justify it with well-known and well-respected fantasy stories and how apparently they've done similar things. It's absolute nonsense. So it says, you would just bring a gun on the first and they shot him in the head. No, they wouldn't, because no one knew. Well, Voldemort technically wasn't even back in the first one. He didn't appear till like halfway through the series. And there was no gun to be brought because no one knew where he was until right at the end when he had an army around him. So that's a load of nonsense. But what really triggers me is this bullshit that people keep coming up with about the Lord of the Rings thing about, oh, why didn't they just take, well, there was no hippogriffs, but I'll take a flying thing, an eagle. Why didn't they just get an eagle? At the end of the film, they got an eagle and they picked up Frodo and Sam and took them back. Why didn't they just take someone with the ring and drop it into the mountain, blah, 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 blah. Because Mordor was full of Sauron's forces. At the end of the film, they were all gone. There was nothing there to stop them. At the start of the films, Fellowship of the Ring, when they first had the ring, Mordor was full of nasties. Those eagles went anywhere near Mordor, and they would have been roasted. The orcs would have been eating eagle that night. It does my head in, the people who are willfully stupid. The bottom line is that there are no inconsistencies on that level in either Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. They are both well thought out, well written stories. And do you know why they're well thought out and well written? Because they were both written by one author who planned everything out in advance, thought it all the way through, and didn't have any interference from anybody. World of Warcraft, on the other hand, has loads of people interfering. And the other thing as well, it's quite clear that they make last-minute decisions, last-minute changes. And we could see this because, remember, the story that we got involving Malfurion, Saurfang and Sylvanas was fundamentally inconsistent in the game as compared to the extra documentation you got with the physical collector's edition of BFA. So between them producing that little booklet for the BFA collector's edition and actually bringing out that patch, someone said, I think we should change this. And it's all that interference in there that causes all these massive inconsistencies. Now, that isn't responsible for that cinematic. That cinematic was just bad writing. That wasn't an interference thing. That was just bad writing. So yeah, but you cannot, those examples for the Harry Potter thing and the Lord of the Rings are a nonsense. Neither of those was feasible. You can't shoot Voldemort when he doesn't even exist, or even when he does, you don't know where he is. And you can't go into Mordor with a few eagles when it's full of an army that's powerful enough to take over the entire world. So there. Anyway, that's that for this week. I'll calm down now and get to assembling some more of these crap Forge World models. And thanks very much for watching. If you've enjoyed it, then please click the like button, subscribe for further content, comment down below, particularly if you know where this particular mailbox is. Remember, I don't just want the specific place, I want the zone as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.